2025, the gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. McClellan, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the minority leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the subject of this special order hour.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, it is with great honor that I rise today to anchor this CBC special order hour. For the next 60 minutes, members of the CBC have an opportunity to speak directly to the American people. Today, the Congressional Black Caucus is remembering an anniversary, a terrible anniversary that happened 62 years ago today in Alabama. And to begin our commemoration, I yield to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Figures.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, this is one of those speeches that I wish that we did not have to give, one of those moments in our history that I wish we did not have to acknowledge in the first place, because by acknowledging it, we are reminded of its occurrence. And this is one of the more tragic acts in American history. The bombing of 4 little girls, made worse by the fact that it happened in a place of worship, that it happened in a church, that it happened in an African-American church. You know, this is an event when you grow up in Alabama, when you grow up black in Alabama. This is one of the seminal events that you hear about in our state's history that you cannot ever forget. And so it's important to me that we sit here in this chamber today to acknowledge this disastrous event and to remember the names of the little girls who were killed and the one who was injured. And so as a son of Alabama and a representative of the birthplace of the civil rights movement today, which is the city of Montgomery, you know, these names of Carol Robertson and Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins, and Cynthia Wesley. These are names that you have to know. And they are names that all of America should know, and they are names that all of us should recognize and appreciate and honor here in this house. They are names that must be said. They are names that must be said repetitively. They are names that must be ingrained into the fabric of this nation. Carol Robertson, Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins, and Cynthia Wesley, and Sarah Collins Rudolph, who took from that day not only the loss of her friends and family member, but also injuries that she still carries with her to this day as she advocates for justice. Let us not forget that this was merely one example of tragic violence that was used as a means to suppress the greatest movement that this world and that this nation has ever seen, which was the civil rights movement. And though these are names that we know and names that we speak of, and one of the more noteworthy or notable or well-known events that happened, there are several others that were the victims of such violence. And we also cannot forget them as we sit here today and honor the 4 little girls in Birmingham. But these are names, some of which you know, some of which you don't. These are names like Medgar Evers, who was assassinated in his fight for equal access to the ballot box. Reverend James Reed, who was a minister, beaten to death while standing with the marchers in Selma. These are names like Viola Liuzzo. These are names like Jimmy Lee Jackson and Jonathan Daniels. These are people who put it all on the line, whose deaths are the reason that I am able to stand here today. And so whenever we have the opportunity, we should always sit here in this chamber and recognize these individuals. I cannot close without quoting the speech that Martin Luther King gave in his eulogy of these four little girls. You know, speaking at a time when racial tensions in the country were enormously high. And never did anyone think that those tensions would result in such a cowardly act as a bomb being placed in a church and set to detonate on a Sunday morning as four little girls were down there getting ready for Sunday school. But he took to the pulpit, and he gave these powerful words that I will quote in part. He said, "These children, unoffending, innocent, and beautiful, were the victims of one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetuated against humanity. And yet they died nobly. They are the martyred heroines of a holy crusade for freedom and human dignity. And so this afternoon, in a real sense, they have something to say to each of us in their death. They say to each of us, black and white alike, that we must substitute courage for caution. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murderers. Their death says to us that we must work passionately and unrelentingly for the realization of the American dream. And so, my friends, they did not die in vain. God still has a way of wringing good out of evil. And history has proven over and over again that unmerited suffering is redemptive. The innocent blood of these little girls may well serve as a redemptive force that will bring new light to this dark city. Those are the words of Martin Luther King as he eulogized these four little girls. And I think a lot of what he references is still true to this day. That we have to, by all means, continue to be unrelenting in our pursuit of the realization of the American dream for everyone. And these four beautiful little girls who unknowingly became the galvanizing symbol, one of the galvanizing symbols of the civil rights movement. These are names that we must know, names that we must continue to say. Carol Robertson, Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins, and Cynthia Wesley. I obviously never had the opportunity to meet either one of them. I have had the privilege to meet several of their family members throughout my life. But to them, I owe an enormous debt of gratitude, because without acts like this, as violent and as vicious and as terrible as it was, without moments like that, there would not have been a Civil Rights Act. There would not have been a Voting Rights Act. There would not have been the progress in this nation that we saw in terms of rights being secured for African Americans, and all people for that matter. Those same rights which led to the possibility of myself and many others being able to stand here in Congress. And so this is about more than an anniversary of celebrating the explosion, celebrating the lives of those that were killed in the explosion. This is about celebrating a galvanizing force for progress in this nation. This is about celebrating the lives of people who are responsible for many of us being here. Because whether you like it or not, the civil rights movement embodied everything that America should be. And it's because of these four little girls that I'm able to stand here today. And also worth noting about this tragic event, to add insult to the injury of four little girls being murdered in a church, justice was not served immediately. Justice was not served a year late, or 5 years late, or even 20 years late. took nearly 40 years for all of the perpetrators involved in this case to be brought to justice. Think about that. 40 years after 4 little girls were killed in a church, and the leaders at the time knew not only that it was the Klan that was responsible, but they knew the individuals who were responsible. But for lack of courage, for lack of cooperation, for lack of willingness, that justice was delayed for nearly 4 decades, 39 years. And it took the involvement of the federal government to finally make that happen. But that story, both the viciousness of this crime, the delayed justice, that story is a story that's not uncommon, especially during acts of violence during the civil rights movement. But despite there being the delay in justice, what was not delayed was the impact that they had on the broader realm of justice and the broader realm of rights that we were able to secure. And though unfortunate and certainly unnecessary and certainly unwarranted, their deaths shine a bright light on the injustices that were happening across this nation, on how black people were being treated in the South, especially in the state of Alabama. And we were able to get through this body and the Senate and across the President's desk the biggest and most beautiful piece of legislation that this nation has ever seen. And that is the Civil Rights Act. And that is the Voting Rights Act. And so, as I close, I want to again say thank you to Carol Robertson, Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, and Sarah Collins Rudolph. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is now my privilege to yield to another member from the great state of Alabama, the Honorable Terry Sewell.
Thank you. I first want to just really thank the Congressional Black Caucus for commemorating this 62nd anniversary of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church with this special order hour. I indeed rise with my colleagues to commemorate the 62nd anniversary of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, and to honor the legacy of the 4 precious little girls killed in that attack. 62 years ago today, parishioners of the 16th Street Baptist Church gathered within its sacred walls ahead of its 11 a.m. service. You know, it was Youth Day that day. That day, 62 years ago, it was Youth Day. So the youth were in charge of that service. And so lots of little girls and little boys were running around the church. At approximately 10:23 a.m., while the 4 little girls were getting dressed in the church basement restroom, 19 sticks of dynamite placed by the KKK exploded. As the walls of the church caved in, more than 100 parishioners rushed for safety. While most of them escaped unharmed, under the debris lay 5 little girls. Today, we must remember all 5. 4 were killed that day, and 1 is still alive today. Today, we remember the name of Addie Mae Collins, of Denise McNair, of Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Morris Wesley. We also remember the name of Sarah Collins, who was the younger sister of Addie Mae Collins. In response to the attack, hundreds of African Americans took to the street to demand justice, only to be met with more violence at the hands of law enforcement. Within hours of the bombing, 2 more children lost their lives in Birmingham, Alabama. Johnny Robinson and Virgil Ware were killed in clashes with the police. Dr. King described the bombing as one of the most vicious crimes ever perpetrated against humanity. Yet despite the horrific nature of the attack, it took more than 34 years for the perpetrators to be faced with justice. In fact, 34 years later, it was only 34 years later that they really all were brought to justice. But make no mistake, the 4 little girls did not die in vain. As my colleague from Alabama, Shamari Figure, so eloquently said, they didn't die in vain. Their murder focused the eyes of the nation on the racial terror being waged against African Americans in the Jim Crow South. And their legacy galvanized the civil rights movement, giving voice to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was because of their death that the nation, in horror, saw 4 little girls who were simply going to church killed. Senseless violence by the KKK. And because of that, we had a Birmingham campaign, a crusade of children who marched and protested in Kelly Ingram Park. It was because of their efforts and the efforts of so many, the sacrifices of so many. It is never lost on Shamari or myself that we get to walk the halls of Congress because 4 little black girls cannot. 4 little black girls cannot. Congresswoman McClellan, we are blessed to be able to represent our home districts. But we know that we are not the first who deserve to be here in Congress. No, we were the lucky ones who stand on the shoulders of those who were murdered, who marched, who bled, who prayed for the opportunity of African Americans to have an equal voice in this society. The sacred right to vote is just as sacred today as it was then. I think all of us in this chamber, Republicans and Democrats alike, respect the late, great Congressman John Lewis, who had the audacity to believe that he could march across a bridge unfeathered by the viciousness of the state troopers. When he was met with that viciousness, it was John with a backpack on his shoulder. I think all of us, that image is seared in my mind. I have the great honor of being a daughter of Selma, growing up in Selma. You can't grow up in Selma, Alabama, without really understanding its place in American history. I often tell my constituents that we are custodians of America's history. What happened on that bridge, the blood that was shed for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it is commemorated year after year after year. The first Sunday in the month of March is Bloody Sunday, a sacred day that for so many years, John Lewis would bring Republicans and Democrats, a bipartisan group, to walk across that bridge. And we don't just come to Selma. He would take us first to Birmingham, where we would sit in the 16th Street Baptist Church, and we would see the beautiful stained glass that was donated by the city of Wells, England, to the church. You know, I have heard Pastor Price, who is the current pastor of the 16th Street Baptist Church, regale that the sermon that day, 62 years ago, the sermon that day was "A Love That Forgives." That was the title of the sermon. A love that forgives. Now, we know that political violence has no place in this society. But how ironic that the pastor was preaching a sermon about forgiveness. As I reflect on our painful past, I am reminded that every gain in the battle for civil rights and voting rights has come at a high cost, paid for by the sacrifices of others. As a direct beneficiary of the legacy of the four little girls, I am honored that my very first piece of legislation that I passed in Congress bestowed upon the four little girls a Congressional Gold Medal on the 50th anniversary of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. Oh, it was a grand day. I got to watch as President Barack Obama signed that bill into law in the Oval Office. And standing to my right was none other than the mother of Denise McNair and the sister of Denise McNair. Standing to my left was a cousin of Carol Robertson. Standing right beside me was Eric Holder and Sharon Malone. Eric Holder, the Attorney General, and his wife, a distinguished doctor, whose sister, Vivian Malone, was the very first African American to integrate University of Alabama. Also there was the Surgeon General, another very proud native of Alabama. The Surgeon General at the time was Regina Benjamin. It was a proud day to be an Alabamian. It was a proud day to be an African American. It was a proud day to be an American. 50 years it took us to acknowledge on this House floor the four little girls. I have to say that perhaps one of the most poignant memories that I have, not just of that day, and yes, Pastor Price, you were there as well, it was really the opportunity to bestow a Congressional Gold Medal to Sarah Collins. And lots of our colleagues came with us that day, came with me, flew to Birmingham months later to actually bestow the Congressional Gold Medal to Sarah Collins. You know, history is riddled with the bodies and blood of those that sacrificed for this country to live up to its creed. This country to honor its principles of justice and equality. At a time when some would seek to whitewash our history and roll back our progress, it has never been more important for us to remember, to ensure that the memory of the four little girls lives on. Their loss paved the way for the freedoms and opportunities that we enjoy today, and that their legacy reminds us that the price of freedom is not free. It's been paid for by the sacrifices of others. I want to thank my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus for hosting tonight's special order hour, and I want to ask both sides of the aisle to join us in honoring the memory of Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, and the life of Sarah Collins. I look forward to having a colloquy with my colleagues about what this really means to all of us. I have to say that as the member of Congress that represents Birmingham, Alabama, and Selma and Tuscaloosa, I was never more proud than to remember the legacy, the amazing legacy that is Alabama's 7th Congressional District. And while I'm honored to represent the constituents of today, I carry with me and know that the legacy of this district is something that must be advanced. It needs to be protected. It needs to be known. It needs to be advanced. I never thought that 60 years after John Lewis was bludgeoned on a bridge, or 62 years after 4 little girls were killed in the bombing, assassinated in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act are in jeopardy. We know that the Shelby versus Holder decision struck down a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, and as we speak, the Supreme Court is considering striking down or nullifying Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. It's on our collective watch that we say no, that we must say hell no, that this body must act. This body can come up with a modern-day formula to determine voter discrimination such that we could put life back into Section 4 that allowed us to say that those states that had a history of voting discrimination must pre-clear every voting law. You know, once that provision had no teeth because they struck down the formula, states across this nation started voter suppression laws, voting on voter suppression laws that didn't have any remedy other than after the fact. We could only sue after the fact. Well, I want to end my portion and join my colleagues for a colloquy by just saying that we who are beneficiaries of this important legacy have a very special role to play. Ours is to legislate, but ours is also to motivate and to mobilize our constituents and this nation, to mobilize and realize that the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act are seminal pieces of legislation that all Americans should acknowledge as the reason why the arc is bending towards justice, as Martin Luther King would say. And we know that that moral arc doesn't bend by itself. It bends at the will, at the sacrifice, at the demands of the people. So as I close, I want us not only to remember their names, but remember their sacrifice. And let's pay it forward. I think we who are beneficiaries must pay it forward. And I don't know about you, but just looking at their faces gives me a pep in my step. We may be living through very troubling times, but we do so because others sacrificed. And it was because of their sacrifice that we get to enjoy the freedoms we do. Thank you, Congressional Black Caucus, for acknowledging today as the 62nd anniversary of the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church.
I thank the gentlewoman and the gentleman from Alabama. Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time is remaining?
The gentlewoman has 31 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to put today's anniversary in a larger context, but first I want to center these 4 little girls again. As the congregation of the 16th Street Baptist Church greeted each other before the start of Sunday service, 5 little girls gathered in the ladies' room in their best dresses. They chatted about the first few days of the school year. They were excited about Youth Day. They were excited to take part in the Sunday adult service. And rather than rising to begin prayers just before 11 o'clock, the congregation was knocked to the ground when a bomb exploded under the steps of the church. And in the basement, 14-year-olds Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and 11-year-old Cynthia Wesley were killed. Addie's sister, Sarah, survived, but lost her right eye. And between 14 and 22 other people were injured. Dr. King described the attack as one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity. And 2 years later, the FBI shut down its investigation after determining that the bombing had been committed by 4 members of the local Ku Klux Klan: Thomas Edwin Blanton, Jr., Herman Frank Cash, Robert Edward Chambliss, and Bobby Frank Cherry. They chose the church because it had been a rallying point for the civil rights activities of that tumultuous spring of 1963. In 1971, Alabama Attorney General Bill Baxley reopened the case and requested evidence from the FBI, and after building trust with witnesses who had been reluctant to testify, they were able to convict Robert Chambliss on November 14, 1977, of his part in the crime. But it would be decades later before the other suspects were tried. On May 1, 2001, Thomas Blanton was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. In 2002, Bobby Frank Cherry was convicted. He boasted that he was the one who planned the bomb next to the church wall. That brag is what sent him to prison. So justice was delayed, but ultimately, justice for these little girls was had. I want to put this in a larger context as we grapple with the fact that political violence has reared its ugly head in America yet again. Yet again, we see anger, fear, hatred, and division across the nation. We've been here before, multiple times. We don't have enough hours in the day to do a special order hour on everyone who has suffered because of political violence. And I want to focus on how we move forward. Because Dr. King's words have been on my mind a lot in the past few years in response to the violence in Charlottesville after the Unite the Right rally, in response to assassination attempts, in response to school shootings, in response to hate crimes, whether political violence, racial violence, or just violence grown out of hate. Dr. King gave us a way forward. In 2 speeches that I come back to as being relevant today. He gave 2 speeches, one in 1957 called Love Thy Enemies, and he gave one in 1967 called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or community? That question is relevant today. We see a lot of chaos around us. We've lost sight of community. But we come out of chaos when we focus on community. So I want to read some of Dr. King's words. In his speech, Love Thy Enemies, yes, it was rooted in the Sermon on the Mount. It was rooted in the commandment that Jesus added on the sermon, in addition to love God and love God as you love yourself, to love your enemies. And he talked about it's difficult to love your enemies. But how do we do it? And he gave some practical suggestions. He said, in order to love your enemies, you must begin by analyzing self. That probably seems strange to you, that I start out telling you this morning that you love your enemies by beginning with a look at self. It seems to me that that is the first and foremost way to come to an adequate discovery of a situation. And he went on to talk about that sometimes there is something in the way a person carries themselves that triggers a hate response or anger in someone else. And he said the first thing you've got to do is look at yourself. Was it something you said? Even if you didn't mean it, something you posted? Take a look at whether you are embodying love. And he said sometimes you just got to admit there are people that just aren't going to like you, and that's okay. But the second and much more important one was that an individual must discover the element of good in his enemy. And every time you begin to hate that person and think of hating that person, realize that there is some good there. And look at those good points, which will overbalance the bad points. And he said, we're split up and divided against ourselves. And there's something of a civil war going on within all of our lives. Now, he put it in the context of what was happening in the South. But I think we've heard rumblings over the past few years, questions, are we facing another civil war in ourselves? And he said, somehow the isness of our present nature is out of harmony with the eternal oughtness that forever confronts us. And that within the best of us, there is some evil, and within the worst of us, there is some good. And we come to see this, we take a different attitude towards individuals. The person who hates you the most has some good in him. Even the nation that hates you most has some good in it. Even the race that hates you most has some good in it. And when you come to the point that you look in the face of every man and see deep down within him what religion calls the image of God, you begin to love him in spite of it. No matter what he does, you see God's image there. I think that's really important. And I regret the fact that I never got to meet John Lewis or Dr. King, because both of them, I want to ask them one question. How did you come to love people who physically threatened or attacked you? But they both found a way to do it. And I think it was rooted in the fact that they recognized, and I think all of us in this chamber, watching and around the world, should remember what John F. Kennedy said. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. We may violently disagree in theory, but that does not mean that we should put that violence into action solely because we don't like what someone has said or what they have done. I think we all need to take a step back and see the face of God in one another. Now, I remember growing up listening to my parents tell stories of my great-grandparents and the racial terror lynchings that they faced. And I remember them telling me stories of the violence of the 1960s. And I remember being lulled into this false sense of security as a Gen X child of the 70s and the 80s, how great it is that we've moved beyond that. Unfortunately, this week reminded us we haven't. And we never will if we don't acknowledge and hold on to the basic decency that tells us, yes, you love your neighbor, but also love your enemy. If we don't, I don't know that we will survive as a country. And that's one of the things Dr. King talked about as a historian. He talked about how different civilizations fell. And he talked about the destructive nature of hatred, not only towards the person that you hate, but towards yourself. One of my favorite quotes from him is how, in both of these speeches, he said, "As for me, I choose love, because hate is too great a burden to bear." And how hate twists you up until it eats you up and destroys you. He told a story about how he and his brother were traveling in Tennessee, and every time they would go down a road, the oncoming car would leave their bright lights on. And his brother said, the next time somebody does that, I'm going to leave my bright lights on. And he said, hold up. Somebody's got to have sense enough to turn out the lights. Because if we don't, we'll both be blinded and run off the road. I think we are at a point where we need to have sense enough to turn off the lights, to turn down the temperature, and remember, our children are watching. Our children are watching. I have been particularly disturbed as we see a rise in gun violence. How many children have gotten to the point where they let their hatred allow them to kill other children? And as I raise a teenager and a tween, as a preacher's daughter, I try to instill in them the same message of love your neighbor and love your enemies. And it's really hard to do that. When I'm away from home, making sacrifices to make their lives easier, and they see not only the violence that we've become numb to, but they see people, their mother included, getting threats. They see people that they have seen in this body who were kind to them when I was sworn in and they stood beside me, say the most vicious things on social media. And they ask some pretty tough questions. And we as leaders in this country have a responsibility to understand that when we stand in this well, at this podium, in our committees, at a press conference, or post on social media, we are not just trying to get clicks, or we shouldn't be. We are not just trying to get attention, or we shouldn't be. We are setting an example for the next generation of leaders. We are setting an example for our children. And I think we need to think about that before we post or we say something in anger. Because if somebody doesn't have sense enough to turn on the lights, our hatred and our blindness, our hatred is going to blind us to the point where we tear each other and ourselves apart. And I get asked all the time, how do you stand it on the Hill? How do you stand in the same room with this person or that person? because I do what Dr. King said, which is rooted in love. I look at that person, even if they give me a reason not to, and I recognize you and I breathe the same air. We both cherish our children's future. We are all worthy of love and respect. We need to get back to that, Mr. Speaker, because if we don't, I don't know where that leads. Does it lead to a civil war? Does it lead to chaos and hate and everybody just being afraid to leave the house or go give a speech, go to a rally, go to the movie theater, go to school, go to church? This violence isn't new. But in the past, we've found a way to come together and focus on community in the midst of chaos. I'm afraid we are losing the ability to do that. And we have a responsibility as members of Congress, as leaders in our communities, to show the way, to show a way towards community, to show a way out of chaos. It's up to us. It's up to us whether we make it to 2026, where we can celebrate a revolutionary idea that the power of government was derived from the people. I don't know if we can do that if we allow hatred to tear us apart. I think we owe it to everyone who has suffered at the hand of violence, political, racial, or otherwise. I want to end with something Dr. King said at the funeral of these 4 little girls whose life we celebrate on the 62nd anniversary of when they died. Now I say to you in conclusion, life is hard. At times as hard as crucible steel. It has its bleak and difficult moments, like the ever-flowing waters of a river. Life has its moments of drought and its moments of flood. Like the ever-changing cycles of the season, life has the soothing warmth of its summers and the piercing chill of its winters. And if one will hold on, he will discover that God walks with him, and that God is able to lift you from the fatigue and despair to the buoyancy of hope, and transform dark and desolate valleys into sunlit paths of inner peace. I think there are a lot of people this week who need that hope. I think there are a lot of people who worry and fear, will they feel the same despair that so many others have felt when a loved one is killed because of hatred? We owe it to Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley to do our part every day to build what Dr. King called the beloved community, where someone will not go to a college campus, go to a church, go to the movie theater, and have their life snuffed out solely because someone hated them. We can get there if we focus on building community out of chaos, and if we focus on the goodness of everybody, and we focus on love. And with that, I yield back.